Welcome to the Working Genius podcast, where we discuss anything and everything related to the 6 types of working genius and how it impacts your work and your life. I'm Pat Lencioni, your host, joined by Bo and Tracy today. Gosh, I almost said Bodie again. I can't believe it, but it's Bo and Tracy. Cody's busy today. How are you guys doing? You're doing great. That's wonderful. I've got Karen sitting with me and Matt producing. And Tracy, why don't you tell us today what the topic is?
Today, we are talking about partnerships and dirty work.
That's right. That's right. We're going to talk about when you're working with one other person in a pair, whether it's marriage, whether it's you're running a company together, it's a co-partnership, whether it's a project you're working on and there's just 2 of you. When any 2 people are working together, and a lot of people do work in 2s, it's really important that you realize that somebody is going to have to be doing a disproportionate amount of dirty work. And by dirty work, what I mean is they're going to have to spend a lot of time in their working competency or even in their working frustration in order to get it done, because it takes all 6 types. And any 2 people, no 2 people cover all 6. And we really want to talk about why that's so important to understand this and how to deal with it.
Yeah, so the first thing, even as we were just preparing for a few minutes before this conversation, is I thought, why on earth do I, and I'm on this podcast, and I love Working Genius. I have Working Genius socks, okay? I love this model. And I'm going into coaching season for my kids' sports teams, and there's always a coach and assistant coach. And it would take 10 minutes for me to send the links, the assessments, which I get for free, by the way, to my assistant coach. But I just need the reminders of every person that I'm working in a partnership with, in a pair with. You just should always know what their geniuses are, because what happens when you don't have that is you end up feeling frustrated because your geniuses aren't recognized, first of all, which is the worst, is when somebody doesn't see that you have, Pat, the genius of discernment that could be used and leveraged, and I feel underutilized when my invention isn't capitalized. So the first step is just make sure you at least know each other's geniuses. And then, to your point into the topic of this episode, inevitably, there will be 2 genius gaps, and there will be, a gap where there's going to be work that needs to get done, and we need to know, of the 2 of us, which one of us is going to do it, and then how do we appreciate and recognize and see the work that person is doing when it's happening.
Right. Because what happens is the person who has less distaste for an activity, whoever has the lower level of so it's my 4th area and it's a low competency of mine. But since it's that person's frustration, this is not overt. We don't talk about it. They just slide into it and end up doing it. Well, and because they don't love doing it, they're not awesome at it. And then the other person will often complain about the way they're doing it. And now they have the double whammy of having to do something they don't like and getting criticized for it. And that is really, really, it's very common. I'll use an example from this weekend. I wasn't going to do this, but I think it really illustrates this. So my son is getting ready to go to college, my 4th son. And so he's got to get a roommate, because he's going to a college across the country, and there's this process. Well, my wife nor my son have G or T. Okay, they don't have that. G is a competency of mine, but I've over the years been burned out doing it. I don't have T also. But we kind of know that it's going to get done because I'm going to go come on, we got to do this. Come on, we got to do this. And both my son and my wife are going why are you so uptight about this? And I'm like, do you know what the deadline is? Do you know how much more work it has to get done? And in the end, they'll say, hey, thanks for making us do that. And that might be 2 weeks from now. But the pain of doing the galvanizing right now is so bad. And if all they said is, hey, Dad, hey, Pat, thanks for galvanizing because we hate having to do it. We know you don't like it either. We know it makes you a little uptight, but at least we're getting this done. So we don't want to make your life any harder. The difference between them understanding that I'm doing something against my will for their benefit versus that I'm doing it because I'm uptight is huge. And I hope that makes sense.
It totally makes sense. And I hear 2 things there. One is the working in your competencies is often the things that most leads to burnout, because you kind of can do it. And you said this a minute ago, that if there's 2 of you and one of you has it as a competency and the other as a frustration, If you don't talk about it, what will end up happening is the person with it as a competency who can do it reasonably well will end up doing it. And then on top of that, if you haven't talked about it, our geniuses are like magnets. We're drawn to the type of work that requires our genius. And so sometimes if you're both in this stage of work where neither of you have a genius, it's tempting for both of you to try to skip that stage of work, to have a shortcut there. And sometimes that means that they try to finish something before it's been discerned. And sometimes it means they might pull back to wonder when actually galvanizing is needed. And so in a partnership, when you're working with two people, we need to take some of our same medicine that we would say to people who are having a meeting, which is name the phase of work that you're in, name the type of work that is needed next, and remember who has that as a genius, a competency, and a frustration. I'm taking a long time to get to this point, Pat, but I've experienced so many times in a relationship with somebody where I'm feeling that elevation sickness, where we're changing phases of work rapidly because of the discomfort that one person has with, again, maybe it's discernment, maybe it's galvanizing, or maybe it's tenacity. And because we don't like that type of work, then we change gears and we try to do a different type of work. Did that make sense at all?
Totally. So Tracy and I work on books together. I'm the writer. She's the editor, right? So we are a team, a dyad, a partnership on that. A dyad. I hate that. That sounds so silly. Well, I have no T. Tracy has T as a competence. So she is going to have to spend a lot of time being tenacious to get me to finish.
Well, and I have E. So I'm capable of working in that stage of work. I think I'm more comfortable in implementation than you are, clearly, Pat, because it's in your frustration. So I can easily go there, and T is in my competency. So it's way more comfortable for me.
Now, here's where it comes down to, though. I will either say, Tracy, thank you for holding me accountable. I know I have to get this done. I'm sorry it's kind of hard for you. Or I can go, gosh, Tracy, can you just stay off my back? Now, it's hard enough that she has to go into her tenacity for me. If I'm actually making her frustrated or making her feel like it's not welcomed, that is going to make it that much worse. And I think that's what we have to do when we work in a pair with somebody else. We have to know when they're doing something that they would prefer not to have to do, we have to reward them for it. We have to thank them for it. And we have to do anything we can to make it easier not to put obstacles in their way.
Your example, Pat, is just so familiar to me because both my husband and I have G in our frustration. This has been an issue with us from the beginning of time, but I am the natural G, and I think it's because I have discernment. So I know that I know the need for it. So I'm constantly inserting myself, and I feel like the nag, and it is awful. But I can tell you, if Greg just appreciated that and lifted me up and said, "Oh, I understand this is hard," it would make it so much easier.
Yeah. And really what it takes is just spelling it out.
And it's crazy we don't do this. I mean, I don't do this with my spouse. I need to. This is insane.
Yeah, exactly. And I love Bo's thing. I've coached teams before where I have an assistant coach. There's just the two of us. It's like, hey, I like this part. You like this part. Neither of us like this part, but you like this part a little even less than I do. I'll do it. But oh man, just know I'm taking one for the team there. And please do anything you can to appreciate it and to make it easier, not make it harder. So there's a couple other examples I wanted to. Karen is just sitting here next to me, and she said in her family, she brings all of the tenaciousness, all the tenacity. And what happens, especially in families, is we take that for granted. Well, it's not that hard for you. Laura says to me all the time, I'm like, oh, I really don't want to have to G this. And she goes, well, hey, you like G better than I do. Which kind of just says so, and it'd be better like, okay, I appreciate the fact that you can tolerate that more than I do. I don't want to make that bigger than it needs to be. In my family, Laura does most of the tea work because at home she has to pay the bills and do all this stuff. She doesn't have to, but she does. And so whenever I see her doing that at home, I'm trying now to go, hey, thank you for doing that. I know that, and because I'm the perfect husband, I always do this. But I try to say, hey, thank you for doing that. I know that's a pain in the butt for you. And I appreciate the fact that you're doing that and that I'm not having to do it.
It's really good. I'm curious your experiences of how this also plays out with people who have the same geniuses that are in a partnership that are working together. And, specifically if you're working with somebody and it comes time to say, well, who's going to be the one to get to discern? Whose discernment wins? Or who's going to be the one that galvanizes? Because two people galvanizing might be less effective than one person galvanizing. How does that play out in a relationship?
I hadn't thought of that. I don't know. What do you think, Trace?
Gosh.
Maybe the dirty work in that case is saying, hey, I will actually back off a little bit and not do the thing I love to do most. So then it's kind of a double whammy. I'm going to go do whatever I don't like to do, and I have to do less of what I do like to do. And that's where the other person should bake them a cake and applaud them when they're doing all those things. And seriously, really appreciating somebody, calling it out like, I see you doing stuff that you don't love, and I appreciate that. That goes such a long way. Such a long way.
Yeah. What do you think about that, Bo? I'm curious. Can you answer your own question?
I mean, it's amazing how recognition and acknowledgement is a theme in this conversation. I'm thinking of two instances. I play in the band at our church, so that's really fun for me. And I'm an inventor. And another guy that plays in the band is an inventor. Well, every time you play a song, you got to figure out how you're going to play it, which is so fun. And I see how meaningful it is when I choose to defer and he recognizes that. Just to be able to say, hey, thanks for letting me have that call. Tim Cooper, who's one of our amazing principal consultants and master facilitator for Working Genius, and I had an interaction several years ago where we needed somebody to do the dirty work, which was actually enablement and tenacity, just gritty, grinding work. And I remember this is years ago. He pulled me aside and he said, hey, you could have been doing anything at this conference, but you're choosing to do the dirty work for us, and I see it, and I'm grateful. And for some reason, that recognition of doing the work that I did not want to do has stuck with me longer than recognition for the things that I was good at, which I did not think of live until this conversation telling the story. So maybe there's a missed opportunity there of when we see people doing the work that they would not choose to do, how our recognition of that can actually be more significant even than when we recognize their geniuses.
You know what's fascinating about that story, Bo, is that it reminds me that I think we always notice it, but we feel guilty. We feel bad that somebody else is doing the dirty work. And so it's very tempting to kind of downplay it, whereas it's much more effective and liberating to walk right into it and go, wow, you're doing a bunch of stuff that I hate doing. And I know you're doing it for me and for the partnership. I'm really glad you're doing that. But sometimes we tend to like, oh, if I don't say anything, I won't have to call it out and I won't feel as bad. So I think sometimes our own guilt of somebody having to do that for us makes us underappreciate it, which is so ironic because it only makes it that much harder. So be the one to say, thank you for doing my dirty work. I'm really glad I got to not have to do that today.
I wonder, the other thing that can be painful in a relationship and when you're working with anybody, whether again it's a spouse or a parent or co-coaching a team, is the assumption, just the assumption that, oh, they'll do that. And I think sometimes that assumption comes if I'm the head coach and somebody else is the assistant coach, the assumption is, oh, the assistant coach will do that, right? Or if somebody else has been in the organization longer or they're the team leader, or they feel like they're the spouse who's more tired, that they'll say, oh, we'll just assume that they will do that. And maybe that gets to some of what you're describing, Pat, of we don't talk about it because we don't want to talk about it, because the conversation might be a little uncomfortable to say, I'm going to ask you to do something that neither of us want to do.
Right. I think it's absolutely true. Enter the danger. Always better to have that conversation than not to, but most of us will tend toward avoiding it because it's going to be uncomfortable. And so much of life is about that. Avoiding discomfort usually creates more of it. You know, there's one last thing I think here. Going on vacation is something like a lot of people, like two people go on vacation. And even going on vacation, Laura and I wrote a book called Travel Mates years ago, which we never got published, but it was about how to travel with another person. Two people. And now we didn't know what Working Genius was then, but if you look at going on vacation, there's W, like, oh, I wonder what would be fun to do. And I, hey, I've got an idea. To D, no, I think that this would be my better tweak. G, okay, let's get excited about this. And E is like, what do you need me to do? And tenacity is like, I'm going to make the bookings. I'm going to do this, whatever else. There are always things on vacation that lag. And if both people, and you're going on vacation, so the thing both of you want to do is not do things outside of your genius. And that is probably why so many people fight when they're on vacation. I bet if you really went and looked at it, it's somebody is having to do something that they hate doing, but they're taking one for the team and it's not really acknowledged.
I'm thinking about a previous podcast episode that we'll link to, which is the Crave and Crushed episode, where it's a good reminder to all of us of when somebody is galvanizing and they do not want to galvanize, they still crave a response. Tracy, when you're having to galvanize your family, or Pat, you're having to galvanize your family, I know that one thing they could do to really help you is to respond, is to do what Tracy's doing right now and nodding and saying yes. And if neither of you have discernment, if there's two people in a relationship that don't have discernment and one person is like, okay, we will sit and we will discern and make sure we're doing the right decision, what will crush them is then somebody saying, well, prove it. Right. So to be aware of that and know that will help us avoid some of these relational pitfalls.
Yeah. Just the other day, somebody was saying, hey, when's the last time you took a great vacation? And I think that Laura and I both said, we before we had children, we did a sabbatical. We did like 3.5 weeks in the San Juan Islands, and it was amazing, just the two of us. We could literally wake up every day and just do whatever we felt like doing. She's an INFP, I'm an ENFP, I'm an ID, she's a WI. Hey, there was nothing that we had to deliver. Since we've had kids, I don't think any vacation we've ever taken has really been a vacation because you have to GET things.
Yes.
Because you just can't go, hey, kids, pile in the car. We're just going to drive around until we find something that we want to do. And so I think that helps me understand. I used to feel so guilty, but you don't go on a vacation with your children. And there are people like you, Bo, who like to G and your wife has T. And so you guys can probably have a little bit more fun like that. But Laura and I always come back exhausted. And now I understand why.
And you have to GET like hour to hour. It's like, it's constant when you're with your kids. It is constant.
Totally. Interesting. So the next time you're doing an activity with another person, sit down and say, hey, what is this going to entail? What do you love? What do you not love? What do you kind of hate? Or do either of us have to do some things we hate? And if we do, let's reward them. Let's make it easy. And let's recognize it because it makes a huge difference. And that's what we wanted to talk about today. All righty? All right. Thanks for joining us on the Working Genius podcast. We love talking to you. We love hearing from you. And so we'll do it again in a couple weeks. God bless.